Could you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about who you are and your connections to Blanco County?
Well, I'm the great-granddaughter of the woman whose marriage license we're looking at here, and we're going to discuss today. Her name is Nora, and this is my mother, Shirley.
And we are going to be discussing why this marriage license is in German, and talk about the people who came into Blanco County. And some of them were like my father's family were Irish, English, whatever, and others, there's a strong German connection in Blanco County also. And a lot of people like myself are what my Granny Smith used to call half-breeds. and so actually, both sides of my family moved into Blanco County in the 1850s, and it's very interesting because they basically all came for the same reason, which was to have a better life and be prosperous and come to actually the Texas had already joined the Union, but it was a very promising place, and the descriptions that you read in the ads that were published in Europe at the time make Texas seem like paradise. And so it was very interesting to look back in your family history and think about the courage it took for these people to come across in a sailing vessel and to a totally new life. Many of them never went back to Europe at all. Others couldn't make it and didn't like it here and turned around and went back. So, but our ancestors stayed.
And what is the date on the marriage certificate?
It's 1921, and 1921 is fairly recent when you think about that. This is 2003, and yet German was still a major official language in Comal County in 1921 for people who were of German ancestry, that they still could get legal papers written in German. And many of them, even at that stage in 1921, even though they had been here since the 1850s and 60s and 70s, it was still their primary language. And so they conducted church, they conducted business, they conducted school. And many of the children who went to English-speaking schools had to learn English after they got to school because German was their primary language. So.
And the grandparents that were married are whom?
Nora was the daughter of a family that Christian Smith Jr. and Johanna Leistico, which these were my great-grandparents. They ended up living on the ranch, 3,000-acre ranch in Kendall County. That was actually, that part of Kendall County was originally part of Blanco County. And it was very interesting for us to look back and see that they came, in the 1850s, they settled first along the Little Blanco River in Twin Sisters. Then they moved over to the Candelia area, and a lot of them went to Bulverde area, which is the Piper family down in that area, or over to Curry's Creek area, which was another settlement. And in fact, that was a German-English settlement because my English grandparents also lived on Curry's Creek for a while before they came to Blanco in 1853. So this ranch was established by Carl and Johanna Leistico, who came from Germany in 1851, somewhere along there. Christian Smith Sr. had also come in 1851. And so they ended up, these two families merged in the marriage of Anna and Christian Smith Jr. And they had 3,000 acres and they raised horses. And so when I was a little girl growing up, we used to go to my great-grandparents' place. And Lee, unfortunately, has missed that experience because the people who bought that ranch have torn down a lot of the pens and things. But there were these huge, big, rock-walled pens with split log rails on the top, where my great-grandfather and his cowboys, some of which were black, by the way, used to handle his herd of horses. And he had like 50 mares at a time with 3 different stallions, and my my mother, who is 90, can remember as a little girl sitting on the top rail of one of those roping pens, they were always circular with a big, huge cedar post in the middle so they could rope the animal and snub it up to that post. And watching a herd of horses come in, a stallion bring his mares in, because my great-grandfather always kept his salt in one of these pens, so they would always make sure that the horses would come back to that pen. And there was open range for a while, so it was like roundup all the time. And my mother can remember sitting there as a child of, say, 6 or 7, and watching the stallion come in with the mares. And she recalls once my grandfather had 2 stallions that fought each other all the time. And of course, her grandmother would get very apprehensive when she and her brother were sitting on this rail above these milling horses that are 2 stallions are going to be fighting each other. So she said one of the stallions finally got to the point where he lost the battle all the time. So when he would hear the bell on the bell mare of this other herd coming in, that he would round up his mares and whoop, out of the pen they would go, and back to the hills they would go. So she said, but it was very interesting because they were a typical German family in the way they were very self-sufficient. My Aunt Clara talked about in an article when she was interviewed by Uvalde paper about growing up on the ranch and the things that they did, like they grew a great deal of their food. Her mother raised turkeys, and she always had a bell on several of the turkeys so that she could figure out where they were. My uncle, by the way, he and one of his cousins they finally some way figured out how to trap a buzzard and put a bell, one of their grandmother's turkey bells, on this buzzard, and she kept saying, "Where is that turkey?" And it was this buzzard flying around overhead. But anyway, we still have a feather bed that my great-grandmother made out of the geese that she raised. She made down feather pillows and down comforters for her family and whatever. And Aunt Clara talks about they always had Christmas with real candles on the tree, which was a German custom. Mm-hmm. And one Christmas, it was pretty lean times because we had a Texas drought during that year, and my great-grandfather always raised sheep and horses, and it was pretty tough times. He had over 50 mares, and so there wasn't much for Christmas that year, so it was pretty lean. But she had, my grandmother, all of them had very fond memories, and I have fond memories of going back to that ranch and seeing where all the family graves are. And one of Anna's brothers had epilepsy, and so he never married, and so he herded my grandfather's sheep. And typical of shepherds all through the world, he built those rock piles of stones as he was watching the sheep and keeping the coyotes and the occasional bear during that time away from the sheep. And so all over that ranch you have these piles of rocks. And if you've ever traveled out in the west and you've seen where the Bass shepherds or whatever have been, you can see those piles of rocks on the hillsides and on the tops of small hills where they stood and watched the sheep and kept watch over them, but pile rocks up, which is a typical shepherd thing I've been told across the world. So kind of interesting to go back there.
And then what did they do with the horses?
Well, the horses were primarily sold to the U.S. cavalry. And when the Civil War came along, of course, that kind of disrupted the horse business for everyone in this area. There were a lot of families in Blanco County and adjacent counties that grew horses. So they sold horses to both the Union troops and also to the Confederate troops. And they were used as draft animals. They also raised mules. And most of the ranches around here will have what we call a jack pen. We have one on our ranch where the male donkey was kept to raise mules with the mares. But most of Grandfather Christian Smith Jr.'s horses were sold as riding stock. And he had a huge big Percheron stallion that we have a picture of that I've forgotten how many hands high he is, but he just dwarfs my grandfather, who was 6 feet tall. Makes him look like a child standing by him. So he spent a great deal of money purchasing this stallion so that he could raise big-sized draft animals, which were used to pull wagons and other things like that. So It's very interesting to see how they like we talk about models of cars, they talked about horses, horses for different purposes because that was their means of locomotion. And he did, as I say, he did have black cowboys, which, of course, his father had fought in the Civil War on the side of the Federals. My other grandfather, on my English-Irish side, fought for the Confederate side. And yet, when David Traynor and Christian Smith Jr. got to know each other, these were both my great-grandparents. They were big buddies, and they used to run their horses on open range, and then they would hold a roundup every year, and they would work together. And so my German grandfather always had black cowboys in a place where the black families lived on the ranch. They were never slaves, but they were people who had been in slavery. And so they came and they worked for him. And so he was very generous with them.
Tell us about the ranch house.
The ranch house is very interesting because my grandmother, Nora, whose wedding certificate we looked at, was actually born in a log cabin. And it wasn't until the turn of the century, about 1900, that they built the ranch house. And there was another house where the Lysicos, my great-great-grandparents, Aunt Anna's mother lived. And that house was pretty much torn down by the time I can remember. But the ranch house was a very interesting house because it was very modern for its day. It was not a typical Texas house from the standpoint that it didn't have the dog trot through it, which most Texas houses did. My grandfather was very adamant that it was going to have a lot of rock to it, and we still haven't figured out why they built. In fact, there are two structures on the ranch that are built this way, that the north side of it is built out of stone and the south side of it is built out of lumber. And somebody's told me that they thought it was because the stone would cut the wind out much easier. I guess after a few Texas Northers, they decided they had to do something. I don't know if that's the real explanation for it or not. But this house, I can remember going and seeing it, and I'm 68, so as a 6 or 8 or 10-year-old child, I was 10 when my great-grandfather died, and then the place was sold by the time I was about 12. It had an underground cistern off of the back door, and you'd go out the back door and there was this big concrete area, and we talk about rainwater collection systems now. Well, that was the way most of the houses had their drinking water, was rainwater collection systems. So even though there was a big hand-dug well just a few hundred feet away, my grandmother and grandfather had this pretty elaborate cistern system put in. And then in the kitchen, which was the modern touch, the turn of the century, was a hand pump with a granite sink with a tin drain board. You know, like we talk about a kitchen drain board now. And so I can remember my great-grandmother having her dishes washing and drying and having things sitting on this and then pumping water. I used to just love to go over there and pump water out of the cistern into the sink, because it was such a novelty to have the pump right in the house, because when I was a little girl, there was no electricity in this area, and everybody had a pump or a bucket that you put down in the well. You didn't have a electric pump like we have now. So anyway, and then my grandfather also had a storage area under the house, and this is where he kept a lot of the supplies that he used with his animals. And one of the things that my mother is always fussed about is that the sea chest that the Lysicos used to come over from England in the 1850s, he used for salt box, which certainly didn't do the box very much good. We still have it. But anyway, and then the ranch house had 4 bedrooms, had a parlor, which had almost like Gus Stickley type simple oak furniture with horsehair stuffing under black leather. I can remember sitting in those chairs, and they would be so big. My grandfather was very large, and he had very big hands. And he used to sit and put his big hands on the arms of this one rocking chair that was his favorite chair, and I think this man has the biggest hands. But, of course, he used those strong hands to control the horses that he worked with, because they're very strong animals, and so his hands over the years have gotten to be very large. It's very interesting because he used a lot of German, and I don't speak German. I learned just a few words, but every once in a while he would he'd mix German and English together, and so I remember the first time he saw hybrid corn, he was absolutely floored at hybrid corn. And, his expression was, my God, look at this cord. And it was like, and he used to call, we still use this expression in our family. Instead of saying block and tackle, he said block and tickle.
Oh.
And so we still say block. I need a block and tickle for this job. But anyway, and he was the kind of person, he was the local banker for Kendalia, believe it or not. And there are still people who owe him money in Kendalia, by the way. But anyway, and he was a person, for example, you talk about his house and his place. He had a windmill. He had one of the first windmills. And because he had a real affinity for dealing with the black families who had been, I guess, because his father had fought on the Union side, when they tried to start the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan in Kendall County, he stopped that dead in its tracks. And so he was a very forceful person. And we have his poll tax that he paid in Kendall County. We have records of that. He had car trouble one time going to Bernie. He did business in Bernie. And so when he walked in and he said, is that car for sale? Yes, I want it. And so right there, traded his car. Mother learned to drive. In fact, he never really drove the car. My mother lived on the ranch, and she and her brother lived on the ranch after her father died. Her original father died, and then her stepfather, her mother got married in 1921, and so mother was 9-10 years old. But anyway, she learned to drive first, and then she taught my great-grandfather how to drive. So here she was, 12 or 13 years old, and teaching her grandfather how to drive the car.
That's typical of
Yes, like the
ranch
computer.
families.
But I told her, I said, now that's the way kids are teaching their parents how to use a computer, and you taught your grandfather how to drive the car. So, but he was very hospitable, and my mother always laughs because she can remember this, is that if he would see someone coming to the house, and they would have to stop and open the gate and come in to the area that he had fenced around the place, he'd say, Anna, scramble some eggs. So they had lots of people at their house.
And lots of family reunions.
Yes. I can remember going there and hunting there and having, they had 5 daughters. They had one son who didn't live past his 10th year, and then they had 5 daughters. And it was a very sad day when that ranch was sold, because those children had come back over the years, and all of us had come back to that ranch over the years, and spent a great deal of time there and everything. And I go to it now, to the cemetery, and see my great-great-grandparents and my Uncle Charlie Lastico's grave, and we try to keep up with the things over there. And it gives you kind of a twang to think that, that's gone now. It's lost. Just
So,
memories.
What happened to the ranch in subsequent years?
Well, the 5 girls decided that none of them really could handle the ranch, and they were all settled into businesses with husbands, and some of them lived in San Antonio and whatever, and so they ended up selling it to the Holt family, and so it's part of the Holt ranch. And actually, Ann Holt and her husband Chris live in my grandparents' house that was built at the turn of the century. And it's very interesting because my grandmother's name was Anna, and of course Ann's name is Ann. And my great-grandfather's name was Christian, and of course Ann's husband's name is Christian. So it's, even have the same initials. And so Ann and her husband think it's kind of a strange coincidence that their names are so similar, and they love living there because it is a very nice place to live. So, but it's in the Holt Ranch, and it's very interesting because the families walked. My mother can remember walking to relatives' homes and whatever, and there are other relatives that live on the adjoining properties, but that place was always kind of the center for everybody to come to. So that center was kind of lost for all of us. But anyway, we have our memories, and lots of good ones.
And what about schooling?
Schooling was very interesting because, like, for example, my great-great-grandfather, Christian Smith Sr., was one of the ones who started the Twin Sisters School, which was in, of course, the first area of Blanco County that was settled was along the Twin Sisters River area, and it was a German settlement. And that school was considered to be, well, like the Germans have always been very pro-education. And like with the kindergartens, they started the whole concept of early childhood education. And so it's very interesting to talk to the people who knew students who went through the Twin Sisters School. First of all, the school building was built with the idea of the best environment for learning. And when the thought came, for example, that natural light was better than artificial light, well, they immediately put lots of windows in that school building. And so they did other curriculum type things, which, were kind of revolutionary for the time in the 1850s, 1860s, whatever. But anyway, they banded together. It was a private school, considered to be a private, not public school. It was owned by the people who, which was typical, was owned by the people who put the money up for the school. My great-grandfather, for example, furnished cypress lumber and did a lot of the hauling of materials and whatever from New Braunfels and whatever, so that the structure of the building itself, which we still use in the community, is used as community center. And we've had a lot of, in fact, we had election for the library and whatever, all this kind of stuff is done in that little school building, which was built 1860s, I guess. And so in the case of after they moved to the ranch, then the kids had to go to Candelia to the school. And there was a little school building outside of Candelia that's not there anymore. Then they built the little rock building in the 1940s, which is still standing and used as a community center. But education was a very important thing for them.
So that explains why you became an educator.
Well,
in
it
part.
does, because fortunately, for me, both sides of my family really pushed education. My grandfather, or great-grandfather, David Trainer, for example, when he had a house full of girls, he had sons too, but he had a house full of girls, and he decided that those girls had to have as much education as the boys, and he was my English relative. He ran his own finishing school for his daughters. And they learned to paint, they learned to play the piano, and they learned to do math, and they learned to do compositions, and all the things that they did not get. In fact, my grandmother went to the normal school. She had the first teaching certificate, from Southwest Texas. And she never really taught school, but then my Aunt Edna, who was her oldest daughter, also had her certificate, and she taught at McKinney and whatever. And so education has been, in fact, in my German side of the family also, it's been one of those things. So I was the first one to get a doctorate degree. I was the first woman to get a doctorate degree in either side of my family, but I was not the first one to get a doctorate degree. So it's been one of those things, Yeah, but that's always been the interesting thing about the German people who came over, that many of them were highly educated people. In fact, Carl Lystico, as much as we can find out, was the mayor of the little town, that the whole town just kind of moved to Texas. And so he started like the Germania Club at Anholt, which was a kind of a social club, and now Germania is an insurance company primarily. A lot of us have Germania insurance on our houses and whatever, but it was started as a social club. And so, and like Sister Dale, those places like that, they would go and when they'd have their weekly meetings, they'd speak Latin. And so it wasn't unusual for people to have that kind of social background and that kind of educational background and whatever. So it was kind of fun to find out what your forebears did back in the 1850s and 60s to keep culture alive. They learned to play all kinds of musical instruments and all kinds of things.
So what was the impetus for all of your forebears?
I often wonder about that. What would make them get on a ship and sail across the ocean? They landed in Galveston, then they transferred to a smaller ship and went to Indianola, and then it was an over the land walk and travel up the Guadalupe River. And in fact, the Lysicos lost a child at sea. She was buried at sea. They lost another child to malaria after they hit Indianola, and on that long trek from the coast up to New Braunfels, basically. And I mean, that's that's a lot of sacrifice to make. And you have to say, what is the impetus for doing that kind of thing? And I'd have to say that probably it's the typical of most American families, is that it's the desire for freedom and a better life for yourself and your children. And even though the German ancestors all came from fairly well-to-do families, they were still in a situation where there were lots of wars in Europe at that time, and especially if you were not a first son, you either had to go into, if you didn't inherit the property as the first son, you had to either go into law or medicine or have land and whatever, and they could come over here and get 3,000 acres where there wasn't 3,000 acres available in Germany. So it was this quest for a better life. And I think it's very interesting to see what these families, all of us, all Americans have made of that opportunity that we have. And we still see it happening,
Oh, yes.
It's not an ended thing. I mean, it didn't happen in the 1850s. It's still, an end is still happening today. So, but it was the same thing that's driven a lot of people to come to this country. Just like, it's like my Granny Nora used to say. She said she can remember her mother thinking, okay, I've got 5 girls to raise, and and she wanted them to have the best. Like my Aunt Nellie was the one who moved to San Antonio, and she always talked about the fact that that life was so different than growing up on the ranch, where she was riding and shooting and, and running roughshod. And when she got married, she married a man whose father and his grandfather had been in the military service. And if you know anything about the military service and military wives, this social life that you're supposed to have, and we have, her mother-in-law's Britannia teapots and all this kind of stuff like this. And she said, you talk about wake-up calls. She said, to switch your roles from being this very independent woman, who's out shooting a gun and chasing the horses and all this kind of bit, to being somebody who has to be prim and proper. She said it was awfully hard to learn to be prim and proper. And so, it's like Anna. We have Anna's, like I said, we have some of her feather beds and her feather pillows that she raised. We have blankets and quilts that she made. She was a great cook. We have some of her pots and pans. We have recipes. She was a child who was truly born in the Texas frontier and lived her life on the Texas frontier, basically. You have to remember that the Comanche Indians were still raiding when these people, all the way through the 50s, 60s, 70s. And actually during the Civil War and after the Civil War was some of the most dangerous times, and they never knew if their children were going to be snatched up when they took them to the river to get a bucket of water or what, or if they went down to the neighbor's house to to borrow a cup of whatever, or go to the post office or to the store or whatever, if they'd ever get home again.
Were there a lot of Indian raids?
Yes. My Granny Smith is the one who told wonderful stories about the Indians in this area and the families and all kinds of things. So,
Could you share one of those with us?
Oh yeah, I'll share one with you. One that I, as an undergraduate student, used in a children's literature class, which is based on a true story. And I'm sorry to say I cannot remember for the life of me the name of the family, Granny Smith. We always talk about log cabins being, built with the cross pieces. Well, a lot of the trees in this area were very small, and so not all log cabins were built that way. Some of them were built just like we'd stick posts up in the ground, and I forgot now what that's called, but they dig a trench and they put a series of these posts in, short tree trunks in, and so this family had built a little cabin like this with a little lean-to on the back. And as I said, it was open range, and so at least twice a year the men would leave the wives and children, and usually there was an older, and my Granny Smith told wonderful stories about these women being left alone, because she was a very independent woman herself. In fact, she insisted that all the girls had to be taught how to shoot a gun, because you never knew when the Comanches were going to raid. And even I was taught a gun, because you never know to shoot a gun, because you never know when you're going to have to be able to protect yourself. But anyway, this woman was left with 2 little children, and her husband went off to help with the roundup. And they rounded up both horses and cattle, so they had different roundups for each one. And so the Indians were raiding around, and the Comanches had several allies, Kiowas and others that raided with them. And so after she'd been there a couple of days by herself, she woke up one morning and she heard this sound in the lean-to, and she couldn't figure out what it was. At first she thought it was some animal had gotten into the lean-to and whatever, and they'd had some food stored there, so she thought at first it was a bear or something, and then, she realized, no, it wasn't a bear, and it made a human kind of groan noise. So finally she got brave enough to open the door and look, and it was an Indian who had been severely wounded. And why he ended up at this cabin, no one knew, okay? But anyway, she felt sorry for him, and so she doctored him. And after a couple of days, she woke up one morning and he was just gone, so she didn't know. Well, the husband came back, and so she told him what had happened, and he said, and he said there was a raid, just a few miles away and whatever, and the family was wiped out and whatever, but that several of the Indians had been shot and killed, they thought, and whatever, but of course the Indians always picked up their wounded and whatever, so they suspected that maybe this man had been involved in that raid. Well, they had a corn patch with a rail fence around it, and after about 6 weeks, 8 weeks after this incident, one night, which my grandmother always talked about, full moons from May through October were the Comanche moons. That's when the Comanches raided, during the full moon time. So it was one of these full moon times, and the corn was up fairly high, like it was July, August, somewhere along in there, maybe late June. And anyway, one night during this full moon, they heard this noise, and it was this, what turned out to be this Indian that this woman had treated, made them understand that they should go hide in the corn patch. And so the man took his wife and the 2 children, and they hid in the corn patch. And about an hour later, a band of Comanches hit that cabin. It was right at dawn, and they hit the cabin right at dawn and burned it down and stole everything they wanted to steal, ran the horses off, and whatever. But the family was hiding in the corn patch. And among the raiders was the guy, the Indian that she had treated, and so, and that what do you say about that? I mean, that shows you that there's human good on both, no matter what, and my grandmother always used to say, you never know when a good deed is going to come back to you. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
And I wish I could remember the name of the family, but she could name the families of all these people, and we live about 2 miles from the little Blanco River, and the freighters used to come from San Marcos to Blanco, and with their ox teams, and the A.C. Lindemann family built that house that the Bensalls live in near us, and they saw the ox team coming down the hill there was like a little camping place on the little Blanco River, and so they thought they were out working in the field, so they thought, well, they'd come by the house that afternoon. Well, they didn't come by, so they thought, well, they were tired, and they had heavy loads on the wagons and whatever, and so when they didn't come by the next morning, well, then the men saddled up their horses and went down there, and the whole team, all the men were dead, and their wagons had been raided, and all the draft animals the Indians had been waiting for them, and that was in the 1870s, only about 2 miles from where we live now. So, and that's why I say you live on Delaware Creek,
Right.
and that's named for the Delaware Indians that were peaceful Indians that came and settled there for a while.
Unfortunately, they didn't stay.
No,
or
they
maybe
didn't stay.
fortunately for us.
No, they were peaceful, but they ran into so much prejudice that they finally ended up going to the reservation in Oklahoma. Yeah.
Okay.
But my grandmother, Granny Smith, knew all, because her family was here in 1853. They settled in Blanco in 1853, and so those were a very perilous time for people. And then you say, why did they come here? I mean, it wasn't like going to a city now, or even to a country. I mean, it would be like going into Afghanistan right now and settling in Afghanistan and not knowing who is your friend and who's not your friend.
Can you tell us one of the notable characters from Blanco?
Well, to me, it was probably the little lady who used to live in the house, the Gates house, or what's it called? The Edwards Kahn house. Her name was Darling. And Blanco used to have fences around every house. Every house in town had to have a fence around it because the people had horses, and they'd also, but primarily cows. They would all have their own milk cow because there was nowhere to buy milk. You had to have a milk cow. And so Mrs. Darling and several other people around would sell milk. Now you talk about milk was on the hoof, okay? And she always had 3 or 4 cows, and she would come through Blanco with these cows on a long lead rope, and go stake them out someplace so that they could eat green grass, and then she'd bring them home and milk them again, because she milked them in the morning, and then she'd go stake them out and whatever. And I can remember as a little girl, because to me it fascinated me, that she would come through town. She and Lem Wagner would come through town, but particularly this little old lady, wore old rubber boots and a big old slouch hat and whatever, and dragging 3 or 4 cows around on a long rope. and then, and having my aunts and uncles and everybody that lived in Blanco buy milk from Mrs. Darling, I was fascinated with her, always fascinated with her.
Did you have to take your own buckets or containers?
Oh, no, well, I guess you did, because I remember my Aunt Ruth had her, what she called her milk bucket, that she would go buy milk from Mrs. Darling, so. But that was, and like I said, everybody had a fence around their place because these animals just roamed. A lot of people didn't stake them out like she did. They would just let their cows out in the morning and they'd just roam. So.
Did everyone have their own well? Or?
Yes, everyone had their own well until the water was polluted and whatever, and then they had to, Another person who was a real character was another woman, was Mrs. Wall, who she started out here as a teacher, and then she married Mr. Wall, who had the furniture store / undertaking business, which after I moved to Greenville, Tennessee, and lived there 10 years, I had to laugh because the Dowdys were one of these, 400 of Greenville, Tennessee, and yet they ran the furniture / undertaking business, and that was a very common thing. Well, when her husband died, even before, but anyway, after her husband died, she took over the undertaking business, and he liked shoes, and so he left several pairs of really good men's shoes. Well, she decided to wear them out, so she used to wear his shoes all the time, which always just fascinated me also. And she was really a sweetheart, she was really a kind person, and actually this lady started the EMS business here because her hearse was used as the first type of vehicle that was an ambulance to take sick people or people who were involved in an accident or something to the hospitals if it needed to be, either here in town or if it was to San Antonio or whatever. One time my mother and dad decided, I was a senior in high school, and they decided I needed to have a new set of bedroom furniture. So anyway, Mother and Mrs. Wall made this thing up that they were going to take me to San Antonio, and I got to choose my own bedroom furniture. Well, to me, the highlight of the trip was to drive in San Antonio with Mrs. Wall, because the minute the stoplight turned red, she stopped no matter where she was in the street. She didn't pull up to the intersection. She just came to a screeching halt. Bang! I thought, Mother and I, we didn't know if to laugh or scream or what. My 90-year-old mother and I still laugh about going to San Antonio with Mrs. Wall. It was a real experience to go into this town with this lady, who had no earthly idea of how to drive in a city. But she was a real character.
Oh, it sounds like it.
Yeah, she's a fun character.
So when were the first automobiles?
Oh, gosh, long before. I say in the teens, 1911, 12, or whatever, there were people who had automobiles. My Smith family group always tells about the first one that my grandfather, Ball Smith, had, and he, of course, was used to driving horses. And you say, whoa, to a horse or a mule or whatever, and it stops. Well, they were attempting to teach him how to drive the car, brand new car he'd bought, open car, no lid on it. I had a little kindergartner tell me one time, this convertible is a car with no lid. But anyway, he came to the wood pile and he couldn't remember how to brake, and so he's screaming, whoa, whoa, and he ran right over the wood pile. So he never drove again. But of course the kids were, they laughed and teased their father about that as long as he lived, and they still laughed about it. Uncle Carol and my dad used to laugh about that all the time. Their dad screeching, whoa, and the car just going. But, that was a real, as I said, my mother actually taught her grandfather how to drive his car, because she took some lessons, so to speak, from her stepfather, and then taught her grandfather how to drive his car. So
That's neat.
that was a real revelation. And of course, there were no roads. I mean, you talk about roads. The building of US 281 was a major. It used to take 2 days to get to San Antonio, because you had to drive around all these little towns, and you wound yourself back and forth, back and forth, back and forth before you got to San Antonio. And to have a straight line highway, US 281, from San Antonio to Blanco was a major transportation coup for these people, because all of a sudden they could get to San Antonio in 3 or 4 hours instead of a day or two.
So that really changed the life of it.
Oh, yeah. My Granny Smith used to talk about twice a year, she and her parents would go to Austin, and they had a camping place. They'd go by wagon, and they'd have to camp out someplace, and it took 2 days to get to Austin, so they always stayed a week, and with relatives, and then 2 days to get back home again. So, and we drive to Austin for lunch, and think nothing of it. And that was a 2-day trip. And that's when they bought barrels of flour and sugar and all that kind of thing.